one of the key things to successful presenting is the message. Mm? And more than perhaps anything else. And again, in your book, you talk about how can you find your key messages with a single question. What's that question?
So the question is, what do I want the audience to do by the end of my presentation, or as a result of my presentation? Yeah. What do I want them to do? So the word "do" is important because, again, that comes back to the theme of it pushes you away from just giving people information and forces you to think about what action do you want people to take. And sometimes that action is obvious. So sometimes it's something like, well, I want them to agree to the project, or I want them to agree to another meeting. Sometimes that's very obvious. Sometimes the ultimate goal of what you're doing can't be achieved in a single presentation. So for example, let's say you're in a classic sales situation and you might have to go and deliver 3 or 4 presentations along this sales pitch process. So your early goals, your ultimate goal might be to win the business from a new client, but you can't necessarily achieve that in a single presentation. So asking the question, what do I want this audience to do as a result of this presentation, gets you very, very clear on how to use the 30 minutes in the room you've got with this audience, really focusing on, okay, at the end of 30 minutes, what do we want them to do? Do we want them to ask more questions? Do we want them to be intrigued enough that they're definitely going to read the handout? At the end of this presentation, we want the audience to read the handout. Well, you change your presentation because you deliberately leave out loads of information about yourselves, right? You deliberately mention the handout during the presentation. And you say, we believe X, Y, and Z. If you want to know why we believe that, there's a whole page in the handout, right? So you sort of, perhaps you're a little bit more provocative with the audience, a little bit more interesting with the audience. So that's the utility of that question. And I found it useful, so useful that every time I work with clients, and most of my work is in teams or leadership teams rather than just individuals. One of the very first things we do is I get people to get very clear on that goal. What do you want people to do as a result of this presentation? And once they're clear on that goal, almost everything else that you can ask about your presentation is answered by going back to that goal. So for example, people will say things like, well, how long should the presentation be? Well, what do you want the audience to do? Should we use slides or not? Well, what do you want the audience to do? Should we send an invitation in advance? Well, what do you want the audience to do? Right. So if you keep coming back to that goal, it can make everything else in the presentation better and